Hi everybody, welcome to my review of episode 2 of the Beatles Get Back movie directed by Peter Jackson. So we had the first episode yesterday, I did my review. If you want to see that episode 1 review, if you've not yet, please feel free to go and watch that first. But it was great to see the positive reaction that people had to that episode. Certainly the main takeaway that I got that people thought was the moment for them was Paul, who just seemed to make up Get Back out of thin air in the studio, and he's just riffing on his bass, and all of a sudden the melody just comes to him in the words and they're away with it. That was that seemed to be a lot of people's highlights for episode 1. Episode 1 finished on that downer of George walking out, quitting the band, and them having a meeting on the Sunday to try and sort things out, and it just said the meeting didn't go well. So that leads us into episode 2 that's just dropped today worldwide, and it's 174 minutes long. I've got loads of notes. I watched this today. I'm going to go through what I sort of feel are the moments that I picked out as my favourites or interesting things that I saw, and I hope that some of it chimes with what you've taken away from it in episode 2 as well. But let me know in the comments which bits of this you've been really enjoying. So it starts off on the 13th of January, and it opens up with Ringo is the only Beatle present. He's the only one who's turned up, and they don't know whether the others are going to show, basically. Eventually Paul and Linda arrive, but it seems that John's assumed to be still in bed. So it's a really kind of slow and nervy start to this particular day, and they're discussing the Sunday meeting, and we hear them say that George just got up and left that part way through. Didn't even stay till the end, so it's not looking good at this point. There's then a really nice part where Paul's talking to the others. John hasn't arrived yet, but Paul's talking to the others, and he's talking about how his relationship with John has changed from, since Yoko arrived, but not in the way that you might expect. He's very complimentary about Yoko. He's saying some really nice things about her, and he's saying how he really likes her, but he's just basically just kind of saying, they just want to be together, and he's kind of acceptance of that, but he's kind of lamenting the fact that it's obviously had a big impact on his relationship with John. He's discussing the live show, is Paul, and he says, something's got to happen this week, and he also mentions the possibility that maybe this whole special that they're recording should end with the band breaking up. That would have been one way to end the show. Paul sort of looks around as he sort of sees that there's him and Ringo there. There's no sign of John. George is off, and he just sort of says, "And then there was 2." And the camera lingers in on him, and he just looks so close to tears. And it cuts to Ringo. Ringo's looking really glum as well. So it doesn't look good at this point. But then John arrives, and there is probably what I thought was just about the most jaw-dropping moment of this series so far. So it says that John arrives and that he and Paul go off to have a private conversation about what's been happening over the last few days. Then it comes up on screen to say, but what they didn't realise was there was a microphone placed in the room where they were in. And we hear the conversation, so you don't get to see it because there wasn't a visual camera. There was just it was just recording the audio. But we hear this conversation between John and Paul, and it's kind of astonishing, really, that we were allowed in to hear this conversation. They both agree that they've treated George unfairly over the years in terms of how they've tried to sort of direct him in songs, maybe not give him the room to grow as he's been capable of doing. They both agree that they've both treated him unfairly. And John really kind of lays bare as well to Paul about how he feels he's been treated by Paul. Just sort of saying he's kind of felt pressured into doing his own songs the way that Paul wants them to be done, and maybe the way that Paul wants them to be arranged. And Paul's really just sort of laying it on the line to Paul here about, this has really bothered me. And so just the fact that we got to hear that, I thought was pretty astonishing. It's like we've heard the Beatles talk in interviews after the event where they've sort of said about fallouts that they've had or conversations that they've had, things that have gone wrong. But we've never really, apart from the famous Paul and George moment that was in episode 1, we've never really sort of seen or heard those things happen as they happened. So I thought that was really incredible, and probably one of the biggest things I've taken away from these 2 episodes so far, to be honest. We've then got John, Paul and Ringo working on Get Back. We're hearing that the lyrics are taking form. We kind of hear them becoming the lyrics that we're going to start to know. They also agreed to put the shows back for a week. Now, what they don't go into at any point in this is any discussions around how that affects Ringo. The whole point of them supposedly doing the shows when they were originally planned around the sort of, I think it was roughly around the 24th-ish of the month, was because Ringo had to go off and film The Magic Christian. So they don't go into any detail about sort of how that affects Ringo's situation, but they basically say they're going to put everything back a week. We then move on to the 14th of January. We've got Paul at the piano. Real interesting piece where he's with one of the crew, and is kind of sort of explaining to this guy how tips about songwriting. We see him playing Martha My Dear at the piano, which was great for me because that was one of my favourite Beatles songs. And he's kind of showing him how to play Martha My Dear as well, so that's really fun. Ringo enters. Paul and Ringo, you've probably seen this clip before where Paul and Ringo are just sort of bashing out a 12-bar blues on the piano. That's what happens at this point. And Paul just sort of starts singing what I assume was an impromptu song that is titled on the screen as I Bought a Piano the Other Day. So a real nice fun moment there between Paul and Ringo. Paul then says, "This is one I came up with this morning," and just starts playing Backseat of My Car. So of course we're not going to, the public aren't going to get to know that song for another couple of years when it appears on Ram. Personally, I've always thought that song would have really suited Abbey Road, but wasn't to be, and it's well worth its place at the end of Ram. But you can see that it's there a couple of years earlier. Paul's that sat there playing that in these January 1969 sessions. We've then got a visit from Peter Sellers. So obviously he's going to be filming The Magic Christian with Ringo shortly in a couple of weeks' time. So he's kind of around and it's going to be filmed in that studio. And we have this sort of meeting where he's, or not a meeting as such, but where he's just kind of hanging around with them. And it's a bit awkward, to be honest. I don't think John and Peter especially really, it just didn't quite seem to gel for me and seemed a bit awkward. And then sort of Peter Sellers sort of gets up and says goodbye and walks out and he's gone. But this day overall, it felt to me like it must have been just about the least productive day there's ever been on a Beatles working day in history. They just sat around achieving nothing, and you hear Paul at the end of it say, "We can't carry on like this indefinitely." And yeah, they really couldn't. I think they had to get more focused after this, otherwise it was just going to fall apart. We then move to the 17th of January. It's the final day at Twickenham. Because by this point, they've had another meeting with George, which we don't get to see a lot of detail on screen about, but we kind of know already what happens in that meeting. It's information that's been around for years. George agreed to come back to the band, but he wasn't going to go back to Twickenham. He wanted the sessions to move to the Apple office on Savile Row. So this is the final day at Twickenham. George isn't there, but you've got Mal and the roadies packing up. They're packing up drum kits and all the musical equipment, while Paul's there recording an Oh Darling demo. Really nice demo, just him on the piano. And then that's it for Twickenham. We've finished the Twickenham sessions and we're going to start moving into Savile Row now, which happens from the 20th of January. But, as it says on screen, there's no cameras allowed in there on the 20th. They decided they just needed presumably a day just to get used to it. But we see the Beatles arriving, and again it's some famous clips that we've seen before of the Beatles arriving, and there've been a couple of the Apple Scruff girls just hanging around outside the building, and we see a little bit of an interview with them where they're sort of they're explaining about why they hang out. They just want to see the band. One of them says that she just wants to see Paul, and then they're asked about, well, what do you hope from the Beatles? What are you wanting from them? And they, we want them to do a show. So it was nice to see that. So the 21st is the first day where they're in Twickenham studios with the cameras there so that we can see what's going on. Spirits seemed really high on this session. John and George, there's quite a funny moment where they've been reading a newspaper article that seems to suggest that John and George have come to blows and been punching each other, which they're just completely denying, but they have like a mock fight where they're come on like this, and just sort of pretending to act out what the papers are claiming has been happening. So that's quite funny. So they then run through various oldies. with a lot of enthusiasm, but it doesn't really feel like it's getting them any nearer to their objective of having an album and a show ready. It just sort of happens with no real purpose, it feels. Then you've got a funny extended sequence with John, George and Ringo. They're jamming on oldies while Paul is shouting into a mic. So he's not playing, the others are playing, but Paul's just shouting into a mic, reading a newspaper article that's criticising the Beatles, saying about how they've all gone weird and they're finished. But they don't include Ringo in this because Ringo just sort of does what he does. So Paul's reading that out in a sort of a mock voice while the others are all just jamming on oldies, and that's quite a fun sequence to see. We've then got Dig a Pony. It's progressing nicely, as is I've Got a Feeling and Don't Let Me Down. You can tell that they're really starting to bring these songs up to some kind of a good standard now. I also noticed at about this point that something about the picture quality. So we know that there's been criticism during episode 1 about the how digital some of the footage looked, and I saw people sort of say about how skin looked sort of like quite waxy and not real. But the footage here looks a lot better quality, and I just wonder whether it's a much better lit room. You look at some of that Twickenham footage and it's quite a dark room, and cameras don't like darkness. That's going to affect the picture quality. So I wonder whether maybe it was a lot of what was done for making this film in terms of the processing of the images was kind of based really on what they had to do because of the lighting in the room. I don't know. I'm not a trained lighting technician, but it just seemed to me that as soon as they were in a bright room, the picture quality looked a lot better and did throughout the rest of the episode. We've also then got the first mention by John of that they could really do with someone to play electric piano. John's been playing a bit of electric piano, but he's obviously fairly basic on that. Paul could do a better job, but who's going to play bass if Paul's doing that? So he mentions that there might be somebody needed at that point, and of course that's going to have big implications fairly soon. We then move on to the 22nd of November, and now it feels much more like we are flies on the wall watching a proper Beatles recording session, rather than a lot of the stuff that we've watched up to this point, which maybe feels like we've been flies on the wall at a marriage guidance counselling session. It actually feels like a Beatles recording session now, and they're playing really well. Coincidentally, or not, I'm not quite sure, Billy Preston happens to pop in to say hello, because obviously he knows them from the Hamburg days. He used to play with Little Richard in Hamburg, and the Beatles got to know him. He's in town, he pops in to say hello, doesn't know that he's about to be recruited into the band. He sits at the piano, the electric piano, and he jams on I've Got a Feeling, and immediately he goes straight to the piano riffs that we know from the final song. It's fantastic, it's magnificent, everybody's blown away with it, and he gets offered the job there and then. Do you want to stay and play with us for a few days? So Billy Preston's on board, and everything just kind of lifts at that point. We then see a moment that harks back to something earlier, where earlier on Yoko had been seen sort of asking where she could get sheet music from. George Martin had suggested a particular shop. And now when the Beatles are playing, you see her sat there with a book, and it opens up and it says The Beatles Complete Works. So she's got sheet music for all the Beatles songs there, and she's sat reading it while the Beatles are playing. So I thought that was quite funny. I also noticed while they were rehearsing Don't Let Me Down, we'd seen a little bit of this on the trailer, and you don't see much more here, but Alan Williams is in the studio, their first manager, the guy who got them the Hamburg gig back in the very early 60s. He happens to be in town, he pops in, and it just sort of seems really weird where he's a person who's just so associated with a completely different phase of the Beatles' career, and he pops up during the Get Back, Let It Be sessions. But you just see him on screen for a few seconds, just sat there, looking pretty bewildered, to be honest, at what's going on. I don't think this is the Beatles as he remembers them. We then get Peter Brown, one of the Beatles' friends, specifically one of John's friends, asking if he's free on Friday to meet up with Alan Klein. And I just kind of got a bit sad at that point, thinking, oh, flipping heck, just say no, John, tell him to get lost. John agrees to see him a couple of days later, but it just makes you think, oh, here we go, it's starting. We then move on to the 23rd of January. We've got a sequence of John, Paul, Yoko and Billy Preston playing what it calls Freak Out Jam with Paul on drums. So that's, I mean, if you've listened to any of Yoko's sort of Plastic Ono band sessions, for example, where she's playing with John, Klaus and Ringo, it's very much that kind of thing where Yoko's doing what Yoko does and Paul's bashing it out on the drums. So that's interesting to see. I'm fine with seeing little bits of this here and there. I know some people don't like it, but, you know, it happened. So I'm fine with that. We've then got some really focused work on Get Back. It's getting a structure. It's becoming more the song that we know. They're looking at where can we give Billy a space for his keyboard solo? Where can we leave space for a guitar solo? And you get that distinctive intro when it all comes in. You see that taking shape as well. So it's starting to become something like what we know. We then get Paul reminiscing about earlier years touring with Jimmy Nicol. And this got me thinking as well, there's so many instances here where Paul's talking and reminiscing about things like Jimmy Nicol in 1964 or things that they were doing in Hamburg, pre-Hamburg, all sorts of things where the Paul is dead people. There is, as stupid as that always has been anyway, but this just blows that out of the water for anybody, I think, who has still got thoughts along those lines. It won't, of course, because they won't be swayed. But, you know, there's no way that if they got a replacement in for Paul McCartney, that they would have trained him up to that level of minutiae of detail. Impossible. They then goof off anyway into sort of self-parodies of Help, Please Please Me, and they're just having fun. It's really good to watch. George then makes a suggestion, George Harrison. He suggests, let's do Get Back now. Let's record it and it can be our single. Everybody seems happy with that as a suggestion, but they don't quite feel ready to do it there and then. So they decide, well, maybe we'll do that tomorrow. But you actually see the conversation there. You see the moment where George says, I think we should have this as the next single. And again, it's quite interesting that George is suggesting a Paul song, because we know that there's been all that tension between them, not just during these sessions but during 1968 as well. George asks at one point, what was our last single? Someone says it was Hey Jude, and you think, well, the last single was a Paul single, and George is suggesting another Paul single here. So it's good to see that George seems fully on board with being a Beatle again, and sort of happy working with all the rest of them. 24th of January now. They're talking about Billy Preston. He's not there on this day because he's got some other commitments that he's got to take care of. John says he wants to ask him to join the band properly as the fifth member of the Beatles. Paul says it's bad enough with four, which again I thought was quite funny. But, you know, they're really seriously seeing the benefits of what Billy Preston can bring to the band here. They decide to try two of us as an acoustic because so far it's been Paul's been on bass, it's been a bit more sort of rocky, but they decide to put John and Paul on acoustic guitars and just see if it helps the groove of the song, because they don't seem to have been very happy with the sort of flow of the song and how it's been going. But immediately it starts to sound a lot more like the song that we know as the final version. So that's starting to have its change taking place around about now. We've seen it several times, but we see it a lot more here now, where, you know, the genesis of the Abbey Road album really is happens within these sessions. And we see John playing Polythene Palm, followed by Paul playing Her Majesty. I'm not sure whether I realised that Paul did Her Majesty during these sessions. Maybe I did know, but I'd forgotten. But we've got more songs that would later appear on Abbey Road being practised here now. There's then a really great moment, which was great to see on camera. It's a really, really happy, fun rendition of Maggie May, followed by Fancy Me Chances With You. It's exactly the same version that's in the recent Let It Be box set in the Apple Sessions disc, but to see it as well, it's probably my favourite version of Maggie May. I think the harmonies work so much better on this, but I loved watching that. It was a lot of fun. We also see as well, earlier on in this day, George had said to Mal, can you get me a bow tie, a black bow tie? Sends him off to the shops to get him one. Mal brings one back, but it's purple. And George doesn't put it round his shirt, he puts it round his neck. So that's been happening a little while earlier. We now see that John must have liked that idea, because suddenly John's got one as well. So John must have at some point asked Mal, hey Mal, can you go and get me one as well? So they're both sat there wearing bow ties around the neck. We then move on to the 25th of January. Paul is there in the morning telling everybody that, he said, last night, he said, I watched the film that we took in Rishikesh, which had obviously been about, 11 months earlier. And he's telling the other band members about all these things that he saw. Pictures of the other people who were there, images of Cynthia, Jane Asher, etc. But we get to see all this while he's talking about it. And I'm just thinking, God, I would love to see this as some sort of proper film. We saw some of it in the anthology. We saw the helicopter taking off that supposedly had the Maharishi and John in it, and a pilot as well, presumably. But you actually see that on the ground now. You see them sat in there. So it's really great to see some of this Rishikesh footage. Apple, we need this film. We need you to get hold of John's private film, Paul's private film, anybody else who did it, and make a proper official film of Rishikesh. That would be fantastic. But anyway, the guys in the studio, they're having a great time in each other's company during this. It just looks like they really, really still love each other despite everything that's gone. They are just so at ease in each other's company, and it's brilliant to watch. And it's such a shame thinking that, we've just heard a little bit earlier that Alan Klein's lurking. That's all going to change over the next few months. And the thought of what you see there happening, them all just having a right laugh in the studio, that couldn't happen a year later. It would be unthinkable. So it's great to watch, but it just makes you feel a little bit sad as well about the fact that, it didn't happen very often after this, because the business things really started to take hold very shortly after this. They're then playing Two of Us, and another really funny part. Again, there's a lot of fun here. They just keep swapping vocal styles to John and Paul. They do a verse where they're singing it in a Scottish accent. They do one that I think was supposed to be a Bob Dylan accent. They do one that's very quiet, and another one that I think was supposed to be Jamaican. And it's just really fun. They're really enjoying themselves. They're playing For You Blue. That's sounding great. We get to see images from the actual take that we know from the album. And, there's the piano part, and it's like a real sort of honky-tonk piano. Well, what you get to see here is that it's actually the same sort of Bluthner piano, that one that they recorded Let It Be on, Long and Winding Road, etc. It's the same piano, but they stuff it full of newspapers so that it's kind of deadens all the strings inside. And because George said, in his words were, I want it to sound like a bad honky-tonk piano. So I don't think I realised that it was the same piano that they used on this. Things then turn a little bit more serious, but not in a friendly way, not in a falling out way. They're talking about the fact that they still have no idea what they're going to do to end this film, because they want this big payoff. They don't just want it to be... They don't, for example, want to play these songs in the studio because it feels like it's not had the big ending that it deserved. And then there's a bit that we see. We don't hear it, and presumably that is because there was no audio that could be recovered from this. Otherwise, they would have played it for definite. You see Glyn Johns sort of knelt down, talking up to Paul. And it comes up as a caption on the screen that this is the moment when Glyn Johns suggests to Paul McCartney, why don't you go up on the roof and play? And so Paul's looking down at Glyn, and you see this sort of come up as it tells you when it's happening, and you just see Paul's face go like that, and you feel like you're witnessing a little bit of Beatles history here. You are seeing that moment when, for the first time, Paul McCartney is given the suggestion, why don't you go up there? And you could tell immediately he's up for that. And then the next thing you see, Paul and Ringo up on the roof. They've got up on the roof, and they're dragging. They've got an arm each of Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, and they're dragging him up the wall and onto the roof. so that he can get up there, so that they can go and survey the scene. He's in his full suit, but they're just pulling him up this wall. So again, that's quite funny to see. So I really wish we could have heard that conversation between Glyn and Paul, but obviously there must not have been audio capturable there, if that's a word. Otherwise, they would have played that to us. So that's great to see the sort of the absolute start of the idea of the rooftop concert. They're then back downstairs. They're doing some work on Let It Be, and they agree between them all to do the concert on the roof. And as it comes up on screen, it says ... in 4 days' time. The end of episode 2. So it's a really good. I wouldn't say it's an episode of two halves. It's kind of an episode of 1/5 and 4/5. That first fifth is really sad. That sort of portion where George is still gone. They have no idea if he's coming back or not. They don't even know if John's going to come in at one point. And you just feel, oh God, it could so easily have all just finished at that point. And then the rest of it is just them being so happy in the studio, what we see. And, you know, we're getting a lot of people saying, oh, this is revisionism. Well, no, this is in far more depth than the Let It Be film ever was. This new Peter Jackson film is not shying away from showing the bad things, you know, George walking out, George and Paul's argument, John and Paul off in a room thinking that they're in secret, sort of basically just saying, you know, you've not allowed me to do what I want for a couple of years. They're not shying away from that. It's still been shown. But, you know, there is a lot more happy stuff happened than we perhaps knew about. And I think we're getting to see this. And I think, if anything, this is probably a more accurate film than anything we've seen before. But 2 episodes in, it's just fantastic. What have we had now? We've had about 5.5 hours so far. The 3rd episode is to come. That's going to come tomorrow. Again, I'll be doing my review of this. I'll be watching it tomorrow. Tomorrow being Saturday as I record this. And I'll be doing my episode 3 review then. And obviously we're going to see the build-up to the rooftop concert. We're going to see their sort of final preparations. Probably a lot of things that we don't know that we're going to see as well. We're going to see that rooftop concert in full tomorrow. How exciting is that? Brilliant. And I expect then it'll probably go on to the day after, which is where they filmed some of the videos. They filmed Let It Be, Long and Winding Road, 2 of us, as actual performances for video. And whilst I could be wrong, what I'm expecting is that will they end this the way that it started? So in episode 1, it started with that kind of 10-minute sort of potted history of the Beatles up to that point. I wonder if it'll finish with something similar. It won't take 10 minutes, but maybe this is what happened next. The February 1969 sessions where they did I Want You So Heavy, for example. It'll probably talk a little bit about Abbey Road. I hope they mention the 3rd of January 1970 session as well, where Paul, George and Ringo recorded I Me Mine. Because, you know, that version that's on the album, that didn't happen in January 69. That didn't happen until nearly a year later. So I'm hoping that will be covered in some kind of detail. So I'm really looking forward to episode 3. It's going to be hopefully as great as the other 2 episodes. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And I'm going to go and let my voice rest because it's going again. But thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.